If you had just one thing to say to either the First Minister, the Prime Minister, or even the President of the United States, what would it be? Would you praise them for their work under difficult circumstances? Would you criticise them for their conduct? Would you offer advice or suggest an alternative way for them to work or conduct themselves? What if you could say one thing to those in your workplace who are in charge without there being any consequences? Would it contain praise or criticism? Would it suggest an alternative way of working? What about church? What would you say to those in our central offices, to those in our presbytery, or those on our Kirk session about church? Would it be filled with praise, criticism, or suggest an alternative way of doing things or being church? It's easy to see where others are going wrong, and it's easy to criticise when we don't have to make decisions or work in particular circumstances. Those in charge or with roles of governance are often the target for criticism. Often it is warranted because their conduct has fallen below the expected standards. The phrase power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely is often the case in places of power and in places of relationship. Jesus' criticism in the reading is focused on the religious leaders of his day. Their conduct and their behaviour were at odds with what they preached. The Jewish authorities ran most things day to day, and they placed an enormous burden on the people. Rules and regulations had grown exponentially. Jesus calls them out for wanting to raise their own profiles, to have their own followers, and to be afforded the best seat in the house at every event. A bit like our modern day social media influencers, except these men were rabbis. These were men who were expected to help and teach the people in their faith journeys. These men had no integrity and were modelling the wrong lifestyle before the people of God, saying one thing and doing another. Now, I wonder if you've ever heard the phrase, or you may well have uttered it, "Tell me, what did your last servant die of?" It's a very brusque and effective way of telling someone that you weren't their servant and what they expected of you just wasn't on. Now, the issue of being a servant to someone is something that many don't even think of as relevant today. It was something that relates to another time and place, a bit like Downton Abbey. Something that just doesn't happen unless you're incredibly wealthy and have a huge house. And for most, well, that is something we will never experience. But actually, many do have someone who in another time would have been known as a servant. A cleaner, a nanny, a gardener, the person who cleans the windows, or the wheelie bin, all of which are done for monetary gain, the jobs which we cannot do or do not want to do. Now, the issue of the Pharisees was that they expected something in return for that which should have been given freely. The Pharisees sought personal gain at the expense of the people and at the expense of God. This was the issue Jesus had, the hypocrisy of the Pharisees. How could the Pharisees serve the people as God had intended when they were the ones being waited upon? They didn't practice what they preached. They were the ones who expected the people to come to them and fuss over them, and humble wasn't really in their vocabulary as a way of behaving. It is often the case when people get into places of authority, they lord it over others. We can easily point out the issues of integrity of leadership within politics, whether that be in America or Westminster or even Hollywood. Leaders that should be above reproach often aren't. That is a problem for others. And we could do likewise in the church. We can lay the blame for the current situation of the national church at the church offices or at the feet of presbyteries or Kirk sessions. But is that fair? Because it's easy to point the finger. In the Church of Scotland, we believe in a priesthood of all believers, which puts a slightly different twist on what the passage is saying. Again, it is easy to point the finger and say, look at this person or that person, look at what they are doing, or look at what they are not doing. But I wonder how often we reflect on how we are doing as a Christian, as part of the priesthood of all believers. What do people see when they look at us? Someone of integrity, or someone who doesn't practice what they preach? Someone who keeps the Sunday worship but is a nightmare to be around the rest of the week, who isn't living like Jesus, but more for themselves? I have a number of colleagues who are having a very difficult time in many parts of Scotland. People are criticising them for not doing enough, for not phoning around, for not opening churches, for not, and you can fill in the blanks. Many of them are working far too many hours as it is and being offered very little help by their congregations. Because you see, it is easier to criticise those we consider to be in charge rather than offer help or reflect on where we are at. There is a programme on Amazon Prime called New Amsterdam. It is set in the oldest public hospital in America that treats everyone regardless if they have money or not. And a new clinical director has been appointed, and on his first day holds meetings in a very large auditorium with medical staff. His first act is to ask how he can help. And the doctors all look at him as though he is trying to trap them. And so when no one answers, he asks one department to identify themselves. And when they do, he fires them all. His reason is that people come before making money, and from what he can see, they had always put money first. He does the same with other departments, and it causes some real difficulties within the hospital at first, which are overcome in time. Whenever he entered any situation, he asked how he could help. Now, he could have chosen to direct people and set down rules and expect everyone to run after him, but he asked how he could help them. He chose the servant lifestyle that Jesus spoke of. He didn't have an easy life, and he knew much personal grief, but as he modelled this lifestyle, it saw the hospital and individuals also change. He was a man of integrity. His words and his actions synced perfectly, and it affected those around him. It caused them to be more courageous and creative, and it changed lives. And incidentally, it's also a true story. It's easy to let ourselves off saying, well, I love my neighbour, I love God. But in practical terms, what does that look like? Just being nice to others? Anyone can do that, and it's a good place to start, but atheists can be nice people. Jesus models a servant lifestyle. He washed the disciples' feet, he taught and he healed, and he got alongside the marginalised. He prayed and he rejected the status quo, the subservient attitude of the people and the dominant attitude of the religious leaders. He turned the established systems on their head. This is not who Jesus is. He's not some meek and mild character who didn't challenge what was. He is angered by the Pharisees and their behaviour. And I wonder, if we're honest, how does he feel about our behaviour? I have a book which I've read called Jesus Called and He Wants His Church Back by a guy called Ray Johnson. It is an interesting book which looks at the way churches operate in America, but could well be describing the church in Scotland. Jesus modelled a servant lifestyle which was based on relationship with God and others. And for Johnson, Christians have replaced replaced relationship with ritual, are known for what they are against rather than what they are for, and don't look much like Jesus in their everyday actions. It is a light-hearted look at a serious subject. In Scotland, we have become far more fixated on buildings and people, far more on ritual, meeting on a Sunday than relationships, knowing the people in our congregation or parish, much more concerned with fabric matters than on feeding the poor. The whole church system not only encouraged this, but actively endorsed it and enabled it. We model by our faith who Jesus is, not only for us, but for others to see. And I wonder who it is they see when they look at us as Christians. There is a van parked on the main road in Broughty Ferry, which I see most mornings. On the back is painted some statements. The language, I have to say, is a bit choice, but it is up to date and relevant. Last week, the slogan, Boris, feed the Wains, appeared on it for everyone who was driving the road to see. And I often wonder what people think of the church as they pass by large stone buildings. Where are our signs of support for issues? Where are our statements about injustice? Do people actually know what the church is for? And you may say yes, but having taught RE for a very short time in schools, I would caution against that assumption. There have been calls by groups to build back better after COVID-19, to bring a corrective to structures and to organisations in order to allow more equality and to reduce poverty and other social ills. And I wonder if we could do likewise in the church, if we could build back better, if we could reorientate ourselves around Jesus rather than tradition and put relationships before ritual. We may get things wrong, but that's okay, because Jesus doesn't ask us to be perfect. He asks us to try to model our lives on him, to be more like him and less like us, to be more graceful, to be more merciful, to be a little kinder, a little more patient, to be more peaceful, and to be good, and to be a servant of all. Now, people look to those who call themselves Christians to see what God is like. Why don't we try to show them the best version of whom we know him to be by how we live in relationship with others? To God alone be the glory. Amen.